In 1971, the middle class represented approximately 61% of American adults. Today, that number is approximately 50%. Most of the movement out of the middle class has not been upward. 5 decades of specific policy decisions produced this outcome, and most of those decisions are documented. None of them required a conspiracy, just aligned incentives, running in the same direction for a very long time. If you have watched previous videos on this channel, you have seen the individual mechanisms. The 1971 monetary decision that untethered currency from physical constraints and enabled permanent inflation. The tax code that consistently favors capital income over labor income. The wage dynamics that decoupled productivity from compensation starting in the 1970s. The retirement system restructuring that transferred risk from employers to workers across the 1980s and 1990s. The debt architecture designed to keep borrowers in extended repayment. The asset price dynamics that respond to monetary policy faster than wages do. Each of these, in isolation, is a documented phenomenon with measurable effects. What this video does is connect them. Because individually, each mechanism has a defensible explanation. Together, they form a system that has been producing the same output for 50 years. A shrinking economic middle. A growing concentration of wealth at the top. A larger population of households whose economic position is structurally more precarious than the equivalent position was for the previous generation. This is not a political statement about who caused it. It is an observation about what the data shows, what the mechanisms are, and what they produce when they operate simultaneously over a long period of time. By the end of this video, you will understand the system as a system, not just its individual parts. Let us start with what the middle class actually was. To understand what is being lost, you first need to understand what the middle class actually was, and what made it viable at a specific point in history. The broad economic middle of developed societies in the post-war decades was not inevitable. It was the product of a specific set of conditions that converged after World War II and began unwinding in the 1970s. Those conditions included a gold-backed monetary system that constrained money supply expansion and maintained relative price stability over long periods. Strong collective bargaining that connected productivity gains to wage growth, so that when workers produced more, they earned more. Defined benefit pensions that transferred retirement risk to employers and provided predictable income in old age. Regulated financial markets that limited the leverage and risk-taking that concentrate asset price gains at the top of the wealth distribution. Tax structures that, while imperfect, maintained a more progressive relationship between income and tax burden than what followed. Educational costs that, especially at the public university level, were genuinely accessible on a middle-income salary, not requiring decades of debt. Healthcare systems, particularly in European economies, that did not expose middle-income families to financially catastrophic medical costs. This combination produced an economic environment where a single earner at moderate income could reliably support a family, own a home, send children to college, retire with dignity, and maintain financial resilience. That is not a description of prosperity in the abstract. It is a description of a specific set of structural conditions that made that outcome possible. Starting in the early 1970s, each of those structural conditions began to change. Not all at once, not through any single decision, but through a series of policy shifts, institutional changes, and market developments, many of which we have covered individually on this channel, that collectively removed the structural supports that had made the middle viable. The changes were not random. In most cases, they had identifiable beneficiaries and identifiable advocates. In most cases, those beneficiaries had more resources to shape the change than the people who would bear its costs. In most cases, the costs arrived gradually, over years and decades, making them harder to attribute clearly and harder to organize against effectively. This is the pattern. And now, let us look at the specific mechanisms in their combined operation. Now let us look at the 5 primary mechanisms, each of which we have covered individually in earlier videos on this channel, and show how they interact. Mechanism 1. The monetary shift of 1971 and permanent inflation. When the dollar was untethered from gold in 1971, the monetary system gained the ability to expand indefinitely. Expanded money supply means inflation. Inflation, as we have covered, benefits asset holders, because assets rise in nominal value with the expanding money supply and disadvantages cash holders and wage earners whose income does not automatically adjust upward at the same rate. The middle class is disproportionately composed of wage earners and cash savers. Mechanism 2. The productivity wage decoupling. As we covered in our video on why your salary will never beat the cost of living, after 1973, productivity in developed economies continued rising while median wages stagnated in real terms. The gains from productivity growth flowed to capital rather than labor. This meant that the economic growth of the past 50 years enriched asset holders at a rate dramatically exceeding the enrichment of wage earners. Mechanism 3. The tax code shift favoring capital over labor. As we covered in our tax code video, earned income is taxed at higher rates than capital income in most developed economies. This means that as more income shifted toward capital gains, dividends, and investment returns and away from wages, the effective tax burden on the most rapidly growing forms of income declined. The middle class earns primarily through labor. Mechanism 4. The retirement system restructuring. The shift from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution plans transferred the risk of retirement from employers to workers and exposed the retirement savings of middle-income households to the volatility of financial markets in ways the previous system did not. Middle-income households, with inadequate retirement, savings, and no pension, backstop now depend on asset markets producing positive returns for their retirement security when those markets underperform, as they periodically do. Middle-income retirement security is directly threatened in ways that concentrated wealth is insulated from. Mechanism 5. The debt architecture we have covered across multiple videos. Student loans that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, and that front-loaded the cost of entering the workforce for an entire generation. Mortgages structured to front-load interest payments. Credit card rates calibrated to the highest psychologically tolerable level. Emergency products priced to extract maximum revenue at moments of minimum financial resilience. Each of these debt mechanisms extracts from the economic position of middle and lower-income households, directing revenue to financial institutions while providing the credit access that supports the appearance of middle-class consumption, even as the underlying economic position erodes. This last point is particularly important. Debt-financed consumption can sustain the appearance of middle-class life. The house, the car, the vacations, even as the net worth position of the household actually declines. Debt is not wealth, but it can look like it for long enough to make the erosion invisible until it is not. If seeing these 5 mechanisms together for the first time as a system changed how you understand your own financial position, stay with me, because seeing the mechanisms individually and seeing how they interact and amplify each other is a different level of understanding. How these mechanisms compound on each other, and what that compounding means for what individuals can actually do. That is what comes next. Here is where the analysis goes beyond listing mechanisms to understanding how they amplify each other. Consider what happens to a middle-income household when all 5 mechanisms operate simultaneously. The 1971 monetary shift produces ongoing inflation that erodes the purchasing power of their wages and savings. The productivity wage decoupling means their wages grow slower than the economy, so they need to borrow to maintain the consumption level that defines middle-class life. The debt architecture provides that borrowing at rates calibrated to extract maximum revenue. Student loans, mortgages front-loaded with interest, credit cards at high APRs. The tax code means that the modest investment portfolio they manage to accumulate generates returns taxed more favorably than their wages, but at a scale that cannot offset the advantages available to larger capital holders. The retirement restructuring means their retirement security depends on that modest portfolio performing adequately in markets that periodically lose 20 or 30% of their value, with no pension floor to fall back on. Now add the interaction effects. Inflation makes borrowing more necessary. Borrowing generates debt service costs that reduce the household's ability to invest. Reduced investment means less asset accumulation. Less asset accumulation means less inflation protection for the next cycle. The cycle produces structural downward pressure on the real financial position of the household even when nominal income appears stable or growing. Now consider the asset-holding household at the top of the distribution during the same period. Inflation increases the nominal value of their assets. Their tax rate on investment income is lower than the middle-income household's rate on wages. Their retirement security does not depend on a defined contribution account performing adequately. They have enough assets to self-insure retirement outcomes. Their debt is strategic leverage rather than survival necessity. Their financial advisors understand the tax code provisions that minimize their tax burden across the full range of structures we have covered in previous videos. The same 5 mechanisms that create structural downward pressure on the middle income household create structural upward pressure on the asset-holding household, not because anyone planned it that way, but because each mechanism was designed or allowed to operate in ways that systematically favor one type of economic position over another. And over 50 years of simultaneous operation, the math accumulates. Here is what understanding this as a system changes about your individual financial decisions. First, it removes the false framing that your financial position is primarily a reflection of your personal choices. It is partly that. It is also partly the accumulated effect of 50 years of structural decisions that preceded you and operate regardless of your individual behavior. Acknowledging that is not an excuse for passivity. It is the accurate starting point for making decisions that account for the real terrain. Second, it clarifies which individual moves actually change your structural position. Not budgeting alone, not saving alone, asset accumulation. Consistently converting earned income into ownership positions that participate in the same inflationary and wealth creation mechanisms that currently favor the top of the distribution. The mechanisms that disadvantage the middle when you hold cash and labor income begin to work differently when you hold assets. You do not need to be wealthy to start owning. You need to understand that ownership is the variable that determines which side of the mechanism you are on. Third, it explains why individual financial literacy and individual action, while genuinely meaningful at the personal level, cannot fully offset structural forces operating at the system level. That is not hopelessness, it is accuracy. Understanding both what you can change individually and what requires collective action or policy change to address keeps your energy aimed at the level where it can have the effect you want. The system is not fixed. Systems built by decisions can be changed by decisions. But they change slowly, and they change most for people who understand them clearly. You now understand this one clearly. The middle class is not disappearing because people stopped working hard enough. It is disappearing because 5 specific structural mechanisms, each documented, each with identifiable beneficiaries, have been operating simultaneously and in the same direction for 50 years. Most people living through this erosion have experienced its effects without a clear picture of its causes. You now have that picture. Share this video with one person who has felt the economic ground shifting beneath their feet without understanding why. And if you want to keep seeing the systems that shape your financial world clearly, subscribe to Hidden Truth Files. Hidden no more.